The first time Noah saw her, she was little more than a shadow bleeding into the darker shadow of the headstone, a silent silhouette against the moon-washed grass. It was 2:17 a.m., and the world was reduced to the damp chill seeping through his worn flannel shirt and the low, ragged sound of his own breathing. 3 months to the day. 3 months since the car accident that left his wife's side of the bed cold, the coffee mug in the cupboard forever clean, the silence in their small house a physical, aching thing. He came to the cemetery at night because the grief was too allowed to bear in the daylight, too exposed under the sun. Here, in the blue-black dark, it felt almost peaceful. Almost. And then he saw the cat. She wasn't approaching him. She wasn't even looking at him. Her entire being was focused on one simple, polished granite marker under an old oak tree. Emma's marker, Noah's wife. The cat was a small, slender thing, her fur the color of tarnished silver and wood smoke in the faint light. She moved, not with the skittishness of a stray, but with a terrible, weary purpose. She walked slowly, her body low, her tail trailing behind her like a whisper. She placed one paw, then another, with a deliberate care that made Noah hold his breath, as if she were performing a sacred ritual the rest of the world had forgotten. The hum of the distant highway was a dull backdrop, a sound he usually tuned out. But tonight, every sense felt raw, scraped clean. He could smell the petrichor of an afternoon rain still clinging to the earth, the faint, green scent of freshly cut grass, and underneath it all, the cold mineral smell of stone. He could feel the vibration of every car passing a mile away, thrumming through the soles of his shoes. And he could see the cat with a clarity that felt supernatural. She reached the base of the headstone and circled once, twice, her nose nearly touching the granite. Then, with a soft, shuddering sigh that seemed to hold the weight of the world, she settled. She didn't curl up. She didn't sleep. She simply lay there, her body pressed flush against the cold stone, her chin resting on her paws, her eyes, wide and unblinking, staring into the dark. She was keeping watch. Noah didn't move. He felt like an intruder, witnessing something profoundly private. This wasn't his grief alone anymore. It was shared with this small, mysterious creature. "Who are you?" he thought, the words echoing in the hollow of his mind. "What are you to her? What was she to you?" The questions tangled with his own pain, a new thread woven into a familiar, brutal tapestry. He visited again the next night, and the next. It became a secret, silent vigil. He'd leave his dark, empty house, the house that still smelled like Emma's perfume if he walked into a room too quickly, and drive the quiet streets to the cemetery gates, which were never locked. He'd walk the familiar path, his heart a dull, heavy drum in his chest, and he'd find her there. Always there, pressed against Emma's grave like she was trying to seep into the earth itself. Some nights, a fine mist would cling to her fur, making her look like a ghost cat, a spirit sent to guard the plot. Other nights, the moon would be bright enough to catch the gleam in her green, watchful eyes. He started bringing things. A small flannel blanket he'd lay a few feet away, hoping she'd use it. She never did. A tin of sardines and olive oil, opened and placed respectfully at the edge of the grass near the stone. The next night, the tin would be licked clean, left neatly beside the headstone. It was the only offering she'd accept. For 3 weeks, this was their routine. His grief was a solitary island, and this cat was a lone sailor circling its shores, never coming close enough to land, yet never leaving. He began to talk to her, his voice a low, rusty thing in the vast quiet. "I don't know if you belong to anyone," he'd whisper, the words swallowed by the night. "I don't know why you're here, but thank you for being with her when I can't be." It was on the 22nd night that everything shifted. The air was colder, threatening frost. Noah's hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and he'd brought a thermos of cheap coffee, more for the warmth it offered his hands than the taste. The cat was in her usual spot, a statue of devotion. But as he turned to leave, feeling the familiar crushing weight of returning to an empty home, he saw it. She had moved. She was sitting up now, and she was looking directly at him. Her gaze wasn't threatening. It wasn't even curious. It was knowing. It was an ancient, deep look that seemed to see straight through his skin and bones, straight into the raw, wounded heart of him. It lasted only a second. Then she turned, melted back into the shadows between the graves, and was gone. But she had left something behind. There, placed carefully in the very center of the flannel blanket he'd left for her, was a single pristine feather, a small, gray-blue feather, so perfect it looked like it had fallen from the wing of an angel. It was a gift, a response, a sign. Noah knelt, his knees cracking against the cold ground, and picked it up. It was impossibly light. He held it in, his palm, and a feeling washed over him. Not peace, not yet, but the first faint, fragile spark of something he hadn't felt in 3 months. Connection. This lonely creature, this keeper of midnight graves, had acknowledged him. She had given him a piece of her world. He closed his fingers gently around the feather, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down his cold cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He sat there in the dark, holding that tiny gift, and for the first time since Emma died, he didn't feel entirely alone. Something had begun. A thread, thin as spider silk, had been spun between 2 grieving souls in the moonlight, and Noah knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this wasn't the end of the story. It was the very beginning. You're here listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your 1 subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The days began to bleed into one another, each one framed by the silent anticipation of nightfall. Noah's days were spent in a kind of haze. He'd go to work at the small, independent auto repair shop he owned, his hands performing the familiar, greasy tasks of rebuilding an engine or aligning tires on autopilot. His mechanic, Leo, a man in his 60s with a perpetual grease stain on his cheek and a heart as wide as the open road, had stopped asking if he was okay. The question just hung in the air between them, unanswered and unanswerable. Instead, Leo would just clap a heavy hand on Noah's shoulder around lunchtime, and wordlessly hand him a pastrami on rye from the deli down the street. Noah would eat it without tasting it. The real world, the world that mattered, existed only after sundown. He started bringing more than just sardines. He brought a softer blanket, a deep navy blue one that had been a wedding gift to him and Emma, one they'd never used because it was too nice. It felt right to bring it here. He brought a small, battery-powered LED light that cast a gentle amber glow, just enough to see her by without violating the sacred dark of the cemetery. He started arriving earlier, sitting on the damp ground a respectful 6 feet from Emma's headstone, and he would talk. He talked to Emma. He talked about his day, the funny thing Leo had said, the '67 Mustang that had come in with a blown gasket, a job that would take weeks, the mundane details of a life that felt like it was being lived by someone else. And he talked to the cat. He named her Silas, after a character in a book Emma had loved, a quiet, loyal guardian. He didn't know if she was a he, but the name felt right. Silas would listen. She'd remain in her spot against the cool stone, her body relaxed, but her eyes always open, always aware. She began to acknowledge him in small, almost imperceptible ways. The slow blink. That first time it happened, Noah felt a jolt of recognition. He'd read about that, seen videos Emma had sent him of cats doing that very thing. I feel safe with you. I trust you. He slow blinked back, his heart hammering against his ribs, afraid a single sudden movement would shatter the moment. Her ear had twitched just once in response. It was a conversation without words, a pact made in the language of grief and companionship. The seasons turned. The crisp autumn air grew sharp and bitter with the promise of winter. Frost began to lace the grass in intricate white patterns every morning, crunching softly under Noah's boots as he walked the path. One night, a cold drizzle fell. Not quite rain, not quite mist. It beaded on Silas's fur like tiny diamonds in the amber light of his lamp. Noah watched her shiver, a tiny, almost violent tremor that ran through her whole body, before she stilled herself again, refusing to abandon her post. "Okay," Noah whispered, his voice husky. "Okay, little guardian. That's enough." He moved slowly, telegraphing his every movement. He unfolded the navy blue blanket and, holding his breath, draped it over her small form. She stiffened. For a heartbeat, her head snapping up to look at him, her green eyes wide. He froze, expecting her to bolt, to vanish into the night and never return. He'd overstepped. He'd broken the fragile spell. But she didn't run. She held his gaze, for a long, suspended moment. Then she gave one slow, deliberate blink. She lowered her head back onto her paws, adjusted her body slightly under the new weight of the blanket, and let out a soft sigh that sounded almost like relief. The trust in that simple act was so immense, it stole Noah's breath. He sat back, down, the cold wetness of the ground immediately soaking through his jeans. But he didn't care. She was trusting him. She was accepting his comfort. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? It's a humbling thing. It chips away at the walls you build around yourself. For Noah, who had built a fortress of solitude and pain, Silas was patiently, silently, dismantling it stone by stone. He began to notice other things. The way she'd arrive exactly 15 minutes after he did, as if she'd been waiting in the wings for his cue. The way she'd sometimes lick a single paw and draw it over her ear in a half-hearted attempt at grooming, her focus never truly leaving the grave. The way her presence began to soften the sharpest edges of his pain. Grieving with her was different from grieving alone. It was shared. It was witnessed. One night, he told her the story. The whole story. He hadn't planned to. The words just started coming, low and stumbling in the quiet dark. He told her about the phone call, the hospital, the way the doctor's mouth had moved, but the words had just been sounds, nonsense syllables that couldn't possibly be real. He talked about the funeral, the smell of too many flowers, the unbearable weight of the dirt hitting the casket. He talked about the soul-crushing silence of the house afterward. He cried. He hadn't allowed himself to cry like that, ugly and unrestrained, since the first week. The tears felt hot and cleansing on his face. Throughout it all, Silas listened. She didn't move from her spot, but her eyes remained on him, soft and unjudging. When his words finally failed him and he was reduced to silent, shaking sobs, she did something extraordinary. She stood up. She shook off the blue blanket and took 3 slow, quiet steps toward him. She stopped just inches from his bent knees. She looked at his face, wet with tears, and she gave a small, questioning murmur, a sound that was not quite a meow, more like a question mark made of sound. Murrow. Then she leaned forward, not to rub against him, not to seek affection, but to press the top of her head firmly and deliberately against his trembling hand. She held it there for a long moment, a perfect still point in his swirling universe of pain. It was a gesture of unmistakable empathy, a silent "I know. I'm here." The touch was electric. It was a current of pure, undiluted connection that shot through his hand and straight into his heart. It was the emotional breakthrough they'd both been moving toward, a silent pact finally sealed. She trusted him enough to break her distance, to offer the only comfort she could. Noah held his breath, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. After a moment, she turned and walked back to her blanket, circling once before settling down again, her back to him now, resuming her watch, as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. The thread between them was no longer spider silk. It was a rope, strong and sure. And Noah knew, as he sat in the cold dark with a dried tear on his cheek and the ghost of her touch on his hand, that he was no longer just visiting his wife's grave. He was visiting their cat. The headbutt changed everything. It was a key turning in a lock, a door swinging open into a new chapter of their strange, night-bound relationship. Silas's vigilance remained, but it was now punctuated by moments of quiet interaction with Noah. She'd allow him to smooth the blanket over her back. She'd sometimes sniff his offered fingers before bestowing a slow blink upon him. But the core of her behavior, her unwavering dedication to the grave, remained a mystery that soon deepened. The first object appeared a week after the rainstorm. Noah had arrived to find Silas already there, not lying down, but sitting, upright and alert beside the headstone. And placed neatly in front of her, as if presented for inspection, was a smooth gray river stone. It was wet, clearly freshly licked clean. It was utterly ordinary, and yet, its placement felt intensely deliberate. "What's this, girl?" Noah murmured, reaching out to pick it up. It was cool and smooth in his palm. Silas watched him intently, her tail giving a single, faint twitch at the tip. She seemed to be waiting for his reaction. "It's nice," he said softly, his voice full of a sincerity that surprised him. "A good rock." He placed it back down carefully at the base of the headstone. She looked from the rock to him and back again, seemed satisfied, and finally lay down, curling her tail around herself. Noah thought little of it. Perhaps she'd just been playing. But 2 nights later, the river stone was gone. In its place was a twisted piece of rusty metal, maybe a fragment of an old fence or a car part. It was shaped vaguely like a heart. Again, it was clean. Again, it was placed with purpose directly facing where Noah usually sat. A pattern was emerging. The gifts, as Noah began to think of them, appeared every few days. A single, vibrant yellow dandelion flower, slightly crushed. A tarnished brass button. A shard of sea glass, worn smooth by time and water. A soft, celestial blue. Each item was small, humble, found. Each one was meticulously cleaned. Each one was laid as an offering at the foot of Emma's grave. Silas would never be seen bringing them. She would simply be there, waiting beside her latest discovery when Noah arrived. Her green eyes bright with something he could only describe as quiet pride. She was curating a museum of small wonders for them. For Emma, it was her ritual, her language of love and loss, and she was including him in it. Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? They must. They must sense the cracks in our armor, the holes in our souls. Because Silas's gifts began to mirror Noah's own emotional landscape. The day he spent sorting through Emma's closet for the first time, finally donating her clothes, to the charity shop and coming home feeling hollowed out and guilty. Silas's gift that night was a single, discarded black leather glove, soft and worn. It smelled faintly of someone else's hand lotion. It felt like a message. "I know you had to let something go today." The mystery of the gifts was captivating. A sweet, gentle puzzle. But a darker, more worrying mystery soon took shape. Silas began to disappear. It started subtly. Noah would arrive, and she wouldn't be there. His heart would plummet. A cold fear gripping him that she was gone for good. That this fragile dream was over. But 10, 15 minutes later, he'd see a movement in the shadows. She'd emerge from between the graves, trotting purposefully, to her spot, often with a new gift in her mouth. She'd look tired, her head a little lower, her steps a little heavier. Then, one night, she didn't come at all. Noah waited for an hour, the cold seeping into his bones, a panic he hadn't felt since the early days of his grief tightening. His chest. Where was she? Was she hurt? Had she been hit by a car? Had she finally, simply moved on? The thought was unbearable. The cemetery, which had become a place of quiet solace, felt vast and menacing again. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was accusing. He left the sardines and the blanket and drove home, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, the house feeling emptier and colder than it ever had before. The next night, he arrived with his stomach in knots. The relief that flooded him when he saw her small form already nestled on the blanket was so powerful it made him lightheaded. But as he got closer, the relief curdled into concern. She looked worn. There was a fresh, angry scratch across her muzzle. A patch of fur on her flank was matted with what looked like dried mud. She was sleeping deeply, her sides rising and falling rapidly, but she stirred as he approached, lifting her head. Her eyes were clouded with exhaustion. "Oh, Silas," he breathed, sinking to his knees beside her. "What happened to you? Where do you go?" She looked at him, and for a fleeting second, he saw not just exhaustion in her eyes, but a deep, profound sadness. It was a look that mirrored his own. She was grieving, yes, but she was also searching. Her journeys were missions. Her gifts were trophies from a quest he couldn't comprehend. The scratch on her nose, the mud on her fur, these were the scars of her dedication. She was risking something every time she left. The fear of losing her became a constant, low, hum in the back of Noah's mind, a new anxiety layered over his old grief. This fragile connection had become the most important thing in his life, the anchor holding him steady. The thought of it being severed was terrifying. He started bringing a first aid kit, gently dabbing at the scratch on her nose with an antiseptic. Wipe. She tolerated it, watching him with a weary patience. The gifts became more poignant. After a day he'd spent crying in his workshop, holding one of Emma's old scarves, her gift that night was a tarnished silver locket, broken, the picture inside long gone. It felt like a symbol, a heart, empty but still present, still held. The tension built silently between them. Noah's worry for her was a physical ache. Her exhaustion was palpable. The mystery of her dual life, the serene guardian of the night and the scarred, weary adventurer of the dusk, was a story he couldn't read. He was only seeing the second act. He didn't know the beginning, and he was desperately afraid of how it might end. The cliffhanger came on a night sharp with frost. Silas arrived late, limping slightly on her front paw. She didn't have a gift. She didn't even go to her blanket. She walked directly to Noah, who was sitting waiting with his heart in his throat. She stopped in front of him and looked up, and she let out a sound he had never heard her make before. It was a small, plaintive meow, thin and reedy with pain and exhaustion. It was a plea. Then she turned and took a few steps away. She stopped and looked back at him over her shoulder, her eyes glowing in the dim light. She meowed again, a more insistent sound. Come on. She was asking him to follow. The routine was broken. The pattern had shifted. The silent vigil was over. It was time to find the truth. The meow hung in the frigid air, a hook in Noah's heart. Every instinct screamed at him to scoop her up, to check her injured paw, to wrap her in the blanket and take her somewhere safe and warm. But the look in her eyes wasn't one of helplessness. It was one of purpose. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was asking for a witness. Okay, he whispered, his breath pluming white in the dark. Okay, Silas, I'm coming. He stood, his legs stiff and cold, and followed her. She moved differently now. This wasn't her slow, ceremonial procession to the grave. This was a determined, albeit limping, trek. She led him away from Emma's plot, away from the familiar path, deeper into the older section of the cemetery. The ground here was more uneven, the headstones older, stained with lichen and tilting at weary angles. Ancient oaks reached their bare, skeletal branches toward the sky, scratching at the moon. Noah's pulse hammered in his ears, a frantic drumbeat against the profound silence. Where was she taking him? The farther they walked, the tighter the knot of anxiety pulled in his stomach. This felt like trespassing. This was her secret, and she was inviting him in. She moved with an unerring certainty, navigating the maze of memory in stone as if she'd walked it 1,000 times. Perhaps she had. She'd pause every so often, glancing back to ensure he was still following, her green eyes flashing in the gloom before she pressed on. The limp in her front paw was more pronounced now, a little hitch in her gait that made his own heart hurt in sympathy. They came to a low, crumbling stone wall that marked the eastern boundary of the cemetery. Beyond it was a thick copse of trees and, faintly, the lights of the suburban neighborhood on the other side. Silas didn't hesitate. She squeezed through a gap in the stones where the mortar had long since eroded away. Noah, his body feeling large and clumsy, had to clumsily climb over, the rough stones scraping against his palms. They were in the woods. The sounds changed instantly. The distant hum of the highway was gone, replaced by the rustle of dead leaves underfoot and the lonely cry of a single owl somewhere in the distance. The air smelled of damp decay and pine. Silas pushed onward, her body low to the ground, a small gray ghost flitting between the trees. Noah followed, ducking under branches, his mind racing. What was out here? After a few minutes, the trees began to thin. Silas stopped at the edge of the tree line, hidden in the shadow of a large pine. She looked back at Noah, then pointed her nose forward. Ahead of them was the backyard of a modest, split-level house. It was dark, save for a single porch light, casting a sickly yellow glow. The yard was unkempt, the grass long and weedy. A rusted swing set sat motionless in the corner, And there, under the wooden deck at the back of the house, was a small, dark opening. Silas looked from the hole to Noah and gave a soft, almost inaudible chirp. There. This was it. This was where she came from. This was the source of her scratches, her mud, her exhaustion. This was her other life. A life lived in the dark space under a stranger's deck. A wave of protectiveness so fierce it made him dizzy washed over Noah. She wasn't just a cemetery cat. She was a stray. She was alone. But why here? What was the connection? As if answering his unspoken question, the back door of the house creaked open. A man stepped out onto the deck, silhouetted against the light from inside. He was large, with broad shoulders, and he held a plastic bowl in one hand. He whistled, a short, sharp sound. "Here, kitty, kitty, dinner time!" Noah froze, pressing himself against the rough bark of the pine tree. Silas didn't move. She didn't run toward the food. She just watched, her body tense. The man sighed, a sound of annoyance that carried clearly in the still night air. Stupid thing. Probably got itself killed. He dumped the contents of the bowl unceremoniously onto the deck near the door. It looked like dry kibble. He went back inside and slammed the door, plunging the yard back into silence. This was no loving owner. This was a chore, a duty performed with irritation. This was where she got food, but it wasn't a home. It was a pit stop. Noah looked down, at Silas. She was still staring at the house, her ears flattened slightly against her head. She wasn't looking at the food. She was looking at a window on the second floor, a window that was dark, and then Noah understood. The connections snapped into place with the clarity of a shattering light bulb. The grave, the gifts, this house. This wasn't just where she lived. This was whose she was. The pieces tumbled together. Emma. Her volunteer work. She'd spent 2 afternoons a week at the county's adult care facility, but she'd also volunteered with a program that delivered meals to homebound seniors. She'd talked about them, her friends, as she called them. She'd worried about them. One of them, Noah remembered with a jolt. She'd been particularly worried about one, an old man, living alone. She'd said his family rarely visited. She'd said he had a cat, a sweet gray shadow that never left his side. "He says she's his only real friend," Emma had said, her voice soft with sadness. "He worries about what will happen to her when he's gone." The man had passed away. 3 months ago. Silas hadn't just lost a friendly visitor. She had lost her person, her entire world. And Emma, her kind, wonderful Emma, had been the bridge between her 2 great devotions. And now, both were gone. The grave was where she grieved for Emma. And this house, this was where she grieved for her old man. She was keeping vigil in both places, trapped between 2 profound losses, belonging to neither, forever waiting for a return that would never happen. Her midnight journeys weren't just searches for gifts. They were pilgrimages. She was walking between the 2 anchors of her heart, both of them sunk in the deep water of death. The truth was a physical blow. Noah's knees buckled. He slumped, against the tree, struggling to breathe, the weight of her loneliness crushing him. This small creature had been carrying a grief as deep and as wide as his own. Her loyalty was infinite, spanning the gap between the living and the dead. A soft sound brought him back. Silas was rubbing her head against his ankle, a gentle, comforting pressure. She was comforting him. She had brought him here to show him this, to make him understand the entirety of her truth. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw no self-pity, only a quiet acceptance of her duty. This was her life now. This was her purpose. Noah sank, to the ground, the cold leaves crunching beneath him. He reached out a trembling hand. Silas hesitated for only a second before she stepped forward. She didn't just sniff his fingers. She pressed the entire length of her body against his side, a solid, warm weight in the cold dark. She purred, a low, rattling vibration that felt like the first rumble of thunder after a long drought. It was a sound of profound trust, of shared understanding. He wrapped his arms around her, careful of her injured paw, and buried his face in her fur. She smelled of damp earth and pine, and the faint, lingering scent of dry kibble. She smelled like love that refused to quit. She smelled like loss, and she smelled like hope. They sat there together under that tree, two lost souls who had finally found each other's coordinates on the map of their grief. He was crying again, but the tears were different. They were for her immense, unwavering heart. She had shown him her truth, and in doing so, she had finally made him understand his own. The pain wasn't something to be endured alone in the dark. It was something to be shared, to be carried together. She had been trying to tell him that all along, with every slow blink, every offered gift, every shared silence. The human finally saw what the cat had been trying to tell him all along. They weren't just two beings grieving separately beside the same stone. They were a pair. They were family. Noah didn't take her that night. It didn't feel right. It felt like another kind of theft. So, he did the only thing that felt honorable. He followed her back to the cemetery, walking slowly to match her limping pace. He watched her resume her post on the blue blanket, pressing herself against the cold granite as if transmitting the news of their journey. I showed him. He understands. He sat with her until the first hint of pearl-gray light touched the eastern sky. Then he drove home, his mind quieter than it had been in months, his soul settled. The next afternoon, he didn't go to the shop. He drove to the house with the unkempt yard and the dark second-story window. He walked up to the front door and knocked. The large man who answered looked annoyed, his eyes squinting against the afternoon light. Noah's voice was calm, steady. "I'm here about the cat. The gray one." The man's expression shifted from annoyance to dismissive relief. "Oh, that thing? Take it. My old man's cat. Been skulking around here for months. We've been dumping food out, but we're not cat people. We're putting the house on the market next month. Animal control was going to be called next week." The words were so callous, so devoid of the beauty and tragedy of the story they contained, that Noah felt a hot surge of anger, but he swallowed it down. This wasn't about anger. This was about love. "I'll take her," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The man just shrugged. "Sure, whatever. One less thing to do." And he closed the door. It was that simple. It was that complex. That night, Noah went to the cemetery not with sardines, but with a proper cat carrier lined with a soft towel. Silas was waiting for him. She seemed to know. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked into the carrier without a sound, turned around, and looked at him through the metal grating. Her gaze was clear, trusting. She knew she was going home. The house stopped being empty that night. It wasn't an instant transformation. It was a slow, gentle softening. Silas spent the first week exploring every inch of the space, sniffing at Emma's photographs, jumping up on the bed they'd shared, and finally, curling up on the pillow that still smelled, faintly, of her shampoo. She was stitching her presence into the fabric of the house, and in doing so, she was stitching Noah's heart back together. Her injuries healed. Her fur grew soft and glossy with regular meals and gentle brushes. The haunted, weary look in her eyes faded, replaced by a contented, peaceful light. She no longer needed to make her nightly pilgrimages. She had brought her two worlds together under one roof. Noah's life was softer now. Mornings were lighter, filled with the soft sound of her purring as she kneaded his chest, demanding breakfast. Nights were less heavy, spent with her curled in the crook of his knee as he read on the couch, her rhythmic breathing a better comfort than any silence could ever be. The grief for Emma was still there. It would always be there, but it was no longer a sharp, stabbing pain. It was a quiet, cherished ache, a memory held in the same heart that now beat with a new furry rhythm. The grave visits didn't stop. They changed. They became weekly trips in the daylight. Noah would bring a folding chair and a book. Silas would leap from his arms the moment they arrived, but she no longer pressed herself against the stone in desperate vigil. She would patrol the area, her head and tail held high, a proud guardian checking her domain. She would then come and sit regally at Noah's feet, watching the birds, accepting the world as it was. She was at peace. She had done her duty, and now she could rest. The final gift appeared on a bright spring morning. Noah was having coffee at the kitchen table, watching Silas bat at a sunbeam on the floor. She suddenly stopped, her ears perking up. She trotted over to the junk drawer, the one Noah had been meaning to clean out for years, and began scratching at it insistently. "What is it, girl? Seen a mouse?" he asked, amused. He opened the drawer, a chaotic mess of old batteries, tangled cords, and takeout menus. Silas immediately plunged her head inside, her tail twitching. After a moment of rustling, she emerged. Triumphant, she dropped something into his palm. It was a button. A small, white, plastic button. Utterly ordinary, but threaded through it was a single, long, dark hair. Emma's hair. It must have fallen from a sweater or a coat she'd worn years ago and had been lost in the drawer ever since. A tiny, forgotten relic of a life lived. Silas had found it. She had presented him with the most perfect, the most profound gift of all. Not a found treasure from the woods, but a reclaimed treasure from their own home. A piece of the past, delivered not with sadness, but with love. A reminder that she was still here, woven into the very fabric of their world. Noah held the button in his hand, closing his fingers around it. He looked at Silas, who was looking up at him with an expression of immense satisfaction. She slow blinked, then turned and went back to chasing her sunbeam, as if she had simply completed a very important task. He understood. This was her way of closing the circle. The gifts had never just been for Emma, or for him. They were a language. And this, the final one, was her masterpiece. It said, "I remember her too, and I am here with you." Love doesn't end, it doesn't die. It changes shape. It finds new vessels. It's a gray cat leading a broken man out of the dark. It's a button in a drawer. It's a purr in the silence. It's the courage to trust again, to build a new family from the pieces of the old. It's the stubborn, beautiful refusal to let go, even as you learn how to move forward. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.